For centuries, the same question has been repeated again and again. Is the Quran we read today really the same as the one recited by Muhammad in the 7th century, peace be upon him? Or has it been modified, corrected, rewritten over time, like so many other ancient texts? The question is perfectly legitimate. For some, the answer is obvious. A text transmitted for 14 centuries could not have remained intact. For others, on the contrary, its preservation is beyond doubt. But convictions are not enough. To provide a serious answer, we must move beyond opinions and return to the facts: manuscripts, historical accounts, scientific analyses, and the work of specialists. The goal is neither to defend one belief nor to attack another. Simply answering a simple question: do we have the same text today as the one that circulated in the 7th century? Because before even asking where a text comes from, we must first know if it is indeed the one that was originally spoken. The investigation begins in 7th century Arabia. At that time, memory held a place we can scarcely imagine today. In a society where writing remained limited and books were rare, memorizing long texts was not exceptional. Entire poems were passed down from generation to generation without written support, and complete family genealogies were recited from memory, word for word. Here, memory was not a fallback solution. It was the most precise tool for transmitting the entire culture. It was in this environment that the Quran emerged. According to Muslim tradition, the revelations were recited gradually by Muhammad over more than 20 years, and very quickly companions learned them entirely by heart. They are called the ḥuffāẓ, those who memorized the entire text from beginning to end. They were not just a handful, but hundreds, even during his lifetime. But this transmission was not solely oral. Simultaneously, several scribes recorded the revelations in writing as they were proclaimed. The most famous was Zayd ibn Thabit, a young companion who became one of Muhammad's principal secretaries. They wrote on whatever materials were available at the time: parchment, animal shoulder blades, pieces of leather, palm ribs, and flat stones. Two channels of transmission therefore exist simultaneously, and above all they are independent: collective memory on the one hand and written text on the other. A passage forgotten by a reciter can be restored thanks to a manuscript. A faulty manuscript can be corrected thanks to hundreds of reciters. This redundancy is an essential element of the text's history, and it already constitutes a first safeguard. To permanently falsify the Quran, it would have been necessary to corrupt both channels simultaneously everywhere at the same time, without any of the hundreds of memorizers noticing. Then a decisive event occurred. Shortly after the death of Muhammad, peace be upon him, several tribes in Arabia revolted. During the Battle of Yamama, many ḥuffāẓ were killed. Muslim sources report that this loss deeply worried the leaders of the fledgling community. If the reciters perished in battle, part of the oral tradition would be jeopardized. The first Caliph, Abū Bakr, may Allah be pleased with him, then decided to compile the text into a single copy and entrusted this mission to Zayd ibn Thabit. The account is preserved notably in Sahih al-Bukhari, one of the most respected collections of Islamic traditions. According to this testimony, Zayd did not simply copy from pages. He compared the written fragments with the recitations of the companions who already knew the text by heart. The aim was not to create a new Quran, but to gather, verify, and commit to writing a text already known to all. Once completed, this copy was kept by Abū Bakr, then by the second Caliph, Umar, and after the latter's death, it was entrusted to his daughter Hafsa, one of Muhammad's widows. A few years pass, and Islam spreads rapidly. In less than a generation, it extends far beyond the Arabian Peninsula. New peoples enter the community with different accents and dialects. Differences in recitation then appear. These are not necessarily disagreements about the content. Most often, they are different ways of pronouncing certain words, or of reading a script still devoid of diacritical marks. Those little dots which, today, allow us to distinguish several Arabic consonants. Faced with this risk of divergence, the third Caliph, ʿUthmān ibn Affan, made a decision around the year 65 that remains at the heart of debates to this day. He had several official copies made from the manuscript kept by Hafsa and sent them to the major provinces of the empire. At the same time, he ordered that personal papers showing differences be withdrawn from circulation. At first glance, the decision might raise an objection. Isn't this a form of censorship? If pages are destroyed, how can we be certain that they didn't contain a different text? The question deserves to be asked, and that's precisely what makes the story interesting. For this episode has never been hidden. On the contrary, it is recounted by Muslim tradition itself in the very same Sahih al-Bukhari. This is not an embarrassing discovery unearthed by modern researchers. The oldest sources openly acknowledge this standardization. The stated goal is not to replace one text with another, but to prevent local copies, with their differences in reading from eventually drifting apart from each other over time. The fact remains that even an old and accepted narrative can always be challenged. To settle the matter, material evidence is needed. And that's where manuscripts in turn begin to speak. Unlike stories passed down through tradition, they have one advantage: they still exist. They can be observed, photographed, compared, and analyzed in the laboratory regardless of the beliefs of those who study them. In 2015, the University of Birmingham announced a discovery that immediately attracted worldwide attention. 2 pages of an ancient Quranic manuscript, written in a script called Hijazi, were radiocarbon-dated at the Oxford laboratory. The result is spectacular, with a confidence level of 95.4%. The parchment comes from an animal that died between 568 and 645 CE. This time frame fully encompasses the life of Muhammad and the first decades following his death. However, precision is key, as honesty is essential here. Radiocarbon dating doesn't date the ink. It dates the parchment, the animal skin on which writing was made. In theory, a parchment can remain unused for several years before being written on. This analysis therefore does not prove that the text itself was written before 645, but it establishes that its support undoubtedly belongs to this very early period. And these folios are not isolated. They belong to a larger manuscript, now dispersed, a significant portion of which is preserved at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris under the reference Arabe 328 c. These texts alone do not prove the entire story recounted by tradition, but they do show that a text very close to the current Quran was already circulating in the 7th century. This already presents a serious difficulty for the theory of a redaction 1 or 2 centuries later. Another manuscript would make the investigation even more troubling. In 1972, during renovations at the Great Mosque of Sanaa, Yemen, thousands of ancient fragments were discovered in an attic. Among them was an exceptional document, a palimpsest, a parchment whose original text had been scraped off to reuse the material, a common practice when parchment was expensive. For centuries, this erased text remained almost invisible until modern imaging, particularly ultraviolet rays, made it reappear. The Sanaa palimpsest thus contains 2 superimposed texts. The upper one largely corresponds to the Quran as we know it today. But beneath this layer appears an older version with several variants. For a time, some saw this as proof that radically different versions of the Quran existed. The detailed examination tells a different story. In their study, published in 2012 in the journal Der Islam, researchers Behnam Sadeghi and Mohsen Goudarzi show that these variants are real but limited. A word order, a slightly different formulation, readings of the companion type, an old copy linked to a particular transmission prior to standardization. In other words, the palimpsest does not reveal a competing Quran that would recount another religion or carry a different message. It shows that before the unification attributed to ḥuffāẓ, copies contain some minor differences, exactly what tradition describes when explaining why a common version was necessary. Often presented as a refutation of tradition, this manuscript in reality confirms it. It shows us, before our very eyes, the before stage that standardization unified. The investigation thus seems to converge. The accounts speak of a collection followed by a unification in the mid-7th century, and the oldest manuscripts show a text already very stable at that time. Yet, one objection remains, undoubtedly the most serious of all. For the past few decades, historians known as revisionists have been proposing a much later history. Scholars such as John Wansbrough, Patricia Crone, or more recently Stephen Shoemaker, have suggested that the text may not have been fixed until the end of the 7th century, or even the 8th, or the beginning of the 9th, and that the Muslim accounts were reconstructed afterward to give the text an earlier origin than it actually was. The hypothesis deserves serious consideration. Many ancient religious texts underwent complex redactions spread over several generations. It would be unwise to dismiss it without evidence. The crucial question is whether the manuscripts themselves support such a late scenario. And to answer it without being a believer oneself, the answer came from the most unexpected place. Not from an imam, nor from a believer, but from an atheist linguist at Leiden University in the Netherlands, Marijn van Putten. A specialist in ancient Arabic, he does not seek to defend Islamic tradition, only to understand scientifically how ancient manuscripts are linked to each other. In 2019, in a leading journal, the Bulletin of the School of Oriental and African Studies, he published a demonstration that owes nothing to faith. His tool is that of an investigator, the fingerprint. His reasoning is simple. Imagine two distant cousins who have the same, very rare mole in the exact same spot. It's not a coincidence, they must have a common ancestor. Van Putten observes precisely this in the manuscripts. An expression meaning the grace of God is written in an unusual way, a small oddity of spelling, and this same oddity is found identical in about 15 very old manuscripts coming from different regions. But that's not what independent copyists would have produced on their own. When the same peculiarity is repeated in several copies, specialists in textual criticism see it as the signature of a common ancestor. This is exactly the method that philologists have used for centuries to reconstruct the history of manuscripts of the Bible or of Greek and Latin authors. They draw up the genealogical tree of the copies, what is called stematic analysis, to trace them back to their source. Van Putten's conclusion is clear. These manuscripts do not descend from independent traditions that slowly converged. They all descend from a single written archetype, a common copy from which they all originated, directly or indirectly. And this conclusion is based neither on carbon-14 dating nor on Muslim accounts. It arises solely from a comparison of the manuscripts themselves. It is secular, reproducible, and because it does not depend on any dating method, it avoids the reservations expressed earlier regarding ink and parchment. In other words, even setting aside Islamic sources entirely, the manuscripts themselves already reveal that they originated from a single, very ancient copying enterprise. This is precisely what tradition attributes to ḥuffāẓ around 650. This is not an isolated result. In 2021, In the Journal of the International Quranic Studies Association, researcher Haitham Sidki takes up the problem again with an independent method, analyzing several large regional codices, a codex being a manuscript bound in book form, as opposed to separate leaves. He reached the same conclusion. The major families of manuscripts also trace back to a very ancient common archetype. Two researchers, working separately, reached the same verdict. We need to assess what is at stake here. On one side, a religious tradition written by Muslims claims that standardization took place around 650. On the other, an atheist linguist, using a completely secular method designed for the study of manuscripts, concludes that there is a single written archetype dating back to exactly that period. The paths are entirely different. They both lead to the same point. This is what the specialist Nikolai Sinai summarizes with a formula that has become common among researchers. The standard text of the Quran is to be placed around the year 650 or earlier. Not by an act of faith, but by the convergence of manuscripts, linguistics, and history. One last aspect remains, often emphasized: oral transmission. Even today, millions of people know the entire text by heart. A child in Indonesia and an elderly person in Morocco can recite the same Quran word for word without needing to open a book. What hundreds of companions were already doing during Muhammad's lifetime has been perpetuated from generation to generation down to us. The manuscripts had recounted the history of the text. This living memory is its continuation. It is important to distinguish between two things that are often confused. The rasm, the consonantal framework of the text, appears remarkably stable in the oldest manuscripts. In contrast, the qirāat, the various reading traditions recognized in Islam, sometimes exhibit variations in vowels, pronunciation, and more rarely wording. These readings have been known and documented for a very long time. They do not correspond to several competing Qurans, but they remind us that the history of the text is more nuanced than the slogan, "Not a single letter has ever changed." We will not say that it would be false and pointless. We will say what is true. The skeleton of the text was established very early on, and it has endured. So, what verdict can be drawn from the investigation? History almost never proves anything like an equation. It progresses by retaining the hypothesis most compatible with all the evidence. And here, ancient accounts, manuscripts, radiocarbon dating, philology, and independent analyses all point in the same direction. Beyond reasonable doubt, everything indicates that the fundamental text of the Quran we read today is indeed the one that was already circulating in the 7th century at the time of the first generation of Muslims. The accusation of falsification does not withstand scrutiny, but we must one last time be honest about what this means and what it doesn't mean. It doesn't prove that the Quran comes from God. It doesn't demonstrate that Muhammad was a prophet. This establishes one thing, and one thing only. We are not studying a work reconstructed centuries after the events, but rather the original text. Preservation is the foundation of the structure. It is not its roof. Here's the second piece. After the challenge, the preservation. Two pieces now placed side by side on the table. The picture isn't complete yet, but it's beginning to take shape. So, since this text is indeed from the 7th century, having come down to us intact, we must now ask ourselves where it came from. How can we explain its content, its assertions, what it describes? Could a desert dweller, all by himself, have produced such a work? That is the investigation that awaits us. If you found this investigation interesting, consider subscribing. Part 3 is coming soon, and that's where everything comes into play. Where did this text really come from? Don't miss it. Thank you for following us this far, and peace be upon you all.